Hi, everyone, and very welcome to Anticipation Conference, to the session Storyworlds and Anticipation. My name is Johannes Triple, and I'm going to share this session. This is a digital session, but here in Lund, we have today tried to innovate a bit around the format for how we are doing the digitally together. So I have invited the panel here in Lund. So we are going to the digital conference together. Panel is up here. I also have a bunch of project colleagues in the audience. And during the day, we have had the coffee breaks and the lunch and the lively discussions. And we have been posting in the chat as the Lund Hub during the day if you've seen our questions so far. So I would like you to introduce the panel here. It's Alexandra Nikoleris and Ruben Ritzén from Lund University. It's Anna Lyngfeldt and Kerry Fazer from Gothenburg University, and Kerry is also at Bristol University. Josephine Wangel, unfortunately, couldn't make it. Online with us, we also have Stuart Candy at the Carnegie Mellon School of Design. You are all most welcome. Everybody from near or afar should feel really welcome. The theme for today is Storyworlds and Anticipation, where the field of anticipation studies has been dominated by attention to models of the future, deriving from traditions in biological scientists, and future studies have been concerned with the systematic constructions of alternative scenarios. This symposium will instead explore the looser idea and the generative idea of a story world as a site and practice of anticipation. One can understand a story world as a world in which multiple stories can be told. In other words, it's the creation of an environment that offers a participatory quality that allows multiple narratives to emerge. And we will explore this further with you today. And we are here today interested in the extent to which story worlds might provide a generative framework for developed democratic, critical, and reflective anticipatory capacity amongst young people, politicians, and civil society. The plan for today's session is to have 3 presentations in a row, starting with Alexandra and Ruben, then over to Kerry, and finally Anna. I will then hand over to Stuart, who will provide some thoughts and comments in response to those brief talks. I will then convene the Q&A session, and please post your questions in the Wova platform and not here in the Zoom chat. It has some advantages because the questions in the Wova platform will stay there. So we answer as many as we can during the session today, but when the session has ended, we can sit down and continue to answer those questions. Then we can continue the discussion there, and that allows us to understand who of you who are interested to explore this further. So please take your time and submit your questions. If you can't access Wova platform, then post them in the Zoom chat. That works as well. But if you don't save it, they will be gone, and we can't respond to them after the session is over. Okay, with no further ado, I'll leave the floor open to Alexandra and Ruben, and please be seated.
Let's see. So, in this first paper, Ruben and I, we want to discuss the extent to which the story world of carbon ruins has allowed for a participatory, democratic, and critical engagement in thinking about transitions to a post-fossil society. And following Peter von Stackelberg and Ruth Jones, we understand a story world as a collection of material which provides a geographical and temporal setting with a coherent ecology, politics, and cultural features. A world in which multiple stories can be told from different perspectives. While coherent, a story world enables a variety of authors, interpretations, and contributions. Engagement with the imaginary worlds of stories is different from engagement with stories per se. A story world shares many features with classic scenarios, but are, at least to us, deliberately collaborative and open-ended, with a work-in-progress quality to them. A good story world mixes the familiar with the unfamiliar to enable critical reflection and invites people to become authors, to explore the world, and by doing so, expand on that world by creating new stories, inventing new places, and bringing new characters to life. Carbon Ruins, an exhibition of the fossil era, is staged as a historic museum from the future. And this is one of our attempts to work with Storyworlds to enable critical and collaborative futuring. Through a range of objects, narratives, performances, and images, Carbon Ruins evidences how humanity finally responded to intensifying climate disruption and transformed society. The collection of objects and the interactive elements of Carbon Ruins frame transition as a process that has already happened. Remnants and artifacts of the fossil era are displayed alongside accounts of their journey to obsolescence, a presentation that estranges them from their original context and instead makes them visible as objects of climate injustice. Do you remember frequent flyer cards, plastic toys, steel bottles, and concrete infrastructures? The transition is not told as a single story, but as multiple fragmented accounts of what happened from different viewpoints and in different timeframes. Each portal object contains information that are detailed to the story world. A basic frame narrative tells us that the year is 2053, that we are in Sweden, and that the Paris Agreement target of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees have been met. A brief outline of what this means for Sweden in terms of local climatic changes, for example, increased risk of forest fires and changes to the length of season, set the world parameters with which all other elements of Carbon Ruins have to be consistent. Participants are then invited to become part of the Carbon Ruins world, to create their own memories of the losses and sacrifices and the joyous moments of transition. We have identified 3 types of what we call authorship, ways in which people contribute to creating the story world. Building on observations and interviews conducted during the last year, we will now reflect on these types of authorship and what they tell us about the critical engagement with post-fossil futures that a story world like Carbon Ruins facilitates.
Thank you. So, the Museum of Carbon Ruins is mostly visited as part of a guided tour. And in this guided tour, the guide often asks the visitors if they have any particular relationship to any of the displayed objects in the museum. And in such a dialogue, the visitors are then collaboratively making sense of the story world and writing themselves into existing events and places. And this is a type of authorship that we have decided to term dweller. It became clear throughout our fieldwork that a central part of the dweller's experience of the museum was the museum's ability to challenge and recontextualize the relationship between human culture and climate change. Because when objects that normally exist in a familiar context are removed from this context and turned into museal objects, they are removed from the normal place in a structural web of cultural norms and seen by these dwellers in a new light. And in this way, you could say that Carbon Ruins acts as a sort of mirror, which reflects our present-day petroculture and lets the dwellers discuss both the objects and their implications for society in a playful and creative way. These discussions also help to reframe and visualize petrocultural systems and relations, and they foster a critical debate about how our place in the system might change in the future. So in this way, the dweller contribution to the story world can be seen as similar to what Sarah Dillon and Claire Craig term story listening, except with a small twist. Because rather than engaging in social interaction through reframing the unknown, the Karma Ruin story world invites co-authors to reframe what's familiar. And in this way, it potentially opens up to a disruptive change of perspective. So by moving away from this single perspective, empathy-focused story of one person's journey towards overcoming adversity, the story world instead allows for the many contrasting perspectives that dwellers co-create to flourish. And in turn, this helps to democratize the discussion of the climate transition and lets more diverse voices be heard. Another way in which co-authors contribute to Karma Ruins is by inventing new stories and new aspects of the story world. And this is a type of authorship that we have decided to term explorer. We decided to term it this way because it expands on the story world. They fill in gaps in the story world. And by taking on the authorship, the co-authorship of a story world as an explorer, it allows for bringing in even more perspectives to the world than a dweller type of authorship does. And one such example is, for example, when we had a group of members from the Swedish church visit the exhibition, and they suggested barbed wire as an object to add to the museum. Explorers can also expand on the story world or the world by altering how it is being staged. So in Västerås, for example, where the museum was hosted, the hosts of Karma Ruins decided to structure the museum around the twin aspects of the word play. So play here meaning both a dramatic stage performance, but also a joyful act of imagination. So the hosts here chose to take on the roles as both guides from the future, speaking from a script in front of an audience, but also to frame this dramatic performance in a positive way and let the participants take part in the performance on their own terms. So in other words, they let them enter the future and imagine that they are other people than they are in their regular everyday lives. And the hosts here fostered this mindset by introducing a so-called rite of passage in the process of entering the museum. And this concept stems from anthropology, and it entails moving a person or a group from one social group to another via various demarcating practices. This could be listening to a certain piece of music, wearing a certain dress, entering a certain space, etc. And you can see an example of this in this quote here. When we did these two guidings, we used the room. We had made it so that you had to step across a threshold to enter the future. When the participants were waiting, they had to drink coffee, which had a future elixir in it. The reception desk also had a space sound that they played when they stepped across this threshold. This is a host from Västerås saying this. And in doing this, the hosts here leveled the hierarchies present in the everyday lives of the participants and created a space where subaltern perspectives and pressure points in the climate debate could be brought up, leading to a democratization of the climate future narrative. The last type of authorship that we have defined is what we have termed originators. And originators are the ones that create the first building blocks of a story world. They invite others to co-create with them as well. And these originators can either build a new story world from scratch, or they can expand upon an already existing one. They therefore have a potentially critical role, you could say, because when they construct a new story world, it always challenges the rules of an already existing one, and it set these two in dialogue with each other. Most of the participants who took on the role of originator in Karma Ruins were researchers or experts from various relevant fields who participated in these initial world-building workshops. They typically had not seen any of the other elements of the museum, since the Karma Ruins story world at that point in time was yet to be constructed. However, after the exhibition was finished and people started exploring it and dwelling in it, offshoots of the original museum start to pop up. And for example, the hosts in Västerås are currently pursuing a plan of using Karma Ruins as a tool to open up a discussion about the future in a Sustainable Development Goals meeting next year. We also have the Glasgow version of the museum. It was specifically designed to fit a Scottish context, and in doing so, they either completely wrote new material, new objects and stories for it, or significantly altered existing ones. So, like rings on water, you could say, the Carbon Ruin story world spreads across barriers, categories, and spaces. A person who was once a dweller might have their organization host carbon ruins, for example, turning them into an explorer. And if that person or that organization then decides to build their own version of carbon ruins, they then become an originator. And each of these forms of authorship allows for different futures to be created, discussed, and interacted with.
So to sum up what we've been saying here, the interactive mode of carbon ruins, its playfulness, but most importantly perhaps, its invitation to contribution, are what we consider the most important elements to democratize the transition we are collectively embarking on. So the continuous creation and co-creation enable engagement across divides, such as expert and public opinion, for example, but also across different groups. The playful component of carbon ruins enabled hard discussions and self-scrutiny that helped make structures of contemporary Sweden visible, serving as a reminder of the fact that we all make history, but not under self-selected circumstances and conditions, to paraphrase Marx. We would also like to believe that when people are given the chance to actively write themselves into a future world and get to play around in that world, they perceive the future as more open, thus opening up for a critical perspective on societal change and for seeing themselves as agents of change. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Alexandra and Ruben. Please post your questions to the Google platform or post them in the Zoom chat if that is easier for you. And we will take up the questions after the presentations and after Stuart's 10 minutes of discussions. So now I hand over to you, Kerry, please.
Okay, so it's really lovely to be here. And it's been a great day, so thank you to Johannes for hosting. So I am doing a little bit of thinking aloud and going slightly outside my remit here. So I'm trying to bring in history and myth and deep old time to our thinking about futures. My real question here is how, if we're going to talk about story worlds, what can we learn from the ancient story worlds that we've inherited? So one of the reasons for this, so I have 4 reasons for thinking about why we should do this. Not feeling defensive at all, but yeah, we have 4 reasons, I think. First one is, we talk about, the power of these popular story worlds, and quite often you'll see Lord of the Rings or you'll see Marvel referenced as powerful spaces that we can go and inhabit. And the reality is we need to recognize Tolkien didn't invent elves, goblins, and wizards. Marvel didn't invent Thor. Both of these are, if you like, the latest version of much, much older stories that really go deep, that were not invented overnight. They're links to stories that have been around for thousands of years that help us understand what it means to be human. And I think we need to engage and really think, what does it mean to try to tell stories that have got that sort of heft, that sort of weight? Because that's what we're trying to do when we make story worlds, I think. The second reason I want to think about myth and story is because we are in a disruptive world. We are in a world of significant change. And there's a couple of people that guide my thinking here. One of them is Amitav Ghosh, writing about the importance of different sorts of stories, from the novel, from the individual psychological accounts that have dominated our literary fiction for the last couple of 100 years. And Ghosh argues that actually, if we're going to get our heads around the complexity of the world that we're living in now, we need different sorts of stories that allow us to take account of disruption, of the unexpected, where things happen that are not in control if only the hero can think their way through it. And then you might turn also to somebody like Martin Shaw, who is, I'll actually go to the next slide here. Martin's argument is that the stories we need right now turned up right on time about 5,000 years ago. And his argument is that what we need to do, what we can draw on when we look at these stories, is not the language of future scenarios, which is often about dealing with uncertainty, but a much deeper, much more challenging question of how do we learn to navigate mysteries? I think that word mystery is quite an interesting one when we think about futures work, because quite often we're trying to create light. And maybe what I'm trying to say in this talk is, what can we learn from darkness? Third reason for thinking about the mythic is that it is part of future studies already. So we can see, for example, in Sahai and Yotulla's work on causal layered analysis, a lot of parallels with some of the ways in which storytellers today are thinking about different sorts of story models. So those of you who are familiar with Sahai's work will argue that any future, if you like, has to operate at the level of litany, if you like, the headline story, the sort of structures underneath it, the worldviews and the myths that drive them. And listening to Tom Hirons simply the other night, he was talking about stories having many different levels, from the deep mythical narrative and world that engages with what he calls mystery, all the way up via legends that start merging, if you like, the mythic and the historical, fairy tales and folklore, where you've got this strange melding of the unknown with a bit more of everyday life, family and cultural tales, anecdote, and at the top, gossip. And his argument is that a powerful story, if you like, allows us to move between those different levels, allows us to see the connection between the gossip as the point of connection, who we are, and then the deep roots down in the world of mystery and myth. And then the fourth reason is one that I'm a little bit nervous to say, but I see quite a lot of really banal stories coming out, really banal scenarios, often developed with the assistance of software or very familiar four-quadrant approaches, and they generate stories that most people forget immediately, that don't resonate with people and have an impact. And I think what we see happening a lot is, in future studies, we're generating stories that fail in their fundamental role. So the fundamental role of futures work is not prediction. It's shocking ourselves out of the present. It's making the present familiar. It's asking ourselves what is going on and seeing it as though it was strange. And so I'm seeing this unsettling of the present more these days in the people who are working with myth and story than I am in much of the work that is coming out as a sort of day-to-day habit in futures worlds. So these are the reasons that I think it's really important for us to think about and engage with myth. The other reason is that these things have been around for thousands of years. I mean, they're astonishing. You know, if we had a monument that had been around that long, we'd be like, God, this is incredible. These stories have been passed from mouth to mouth, from body to body, for thousands of years. And one of the things that I think is really powerful of them is that they've been strengthened by the power of forgetting. So we've forgotten the stuff we don't need. So they're powerful and they're not insipid. So we should all just go and read them, okay? End of story. There we go, I'm off. What I want to do, though, is think about what can we learn from myth and old stories when we're thinking about designing our stories, our future story worlds in particular. And just to give you a sense of some of the traditions that I'm talking about here, you will all have your own myths and traditions that you're drawing on. These are ones that have been dear to me at various points, from Nordic mythology, which I have to mention because we are in Sweden, and also because we have the most amazing images of, you know, this ancient tree and these Norns who sit at the bottom spinning fates. I mean, what's going on there? And then you've got Freya, who moves between realms with her cats. I mean, she rocks. And we've also got, you know, Thor and Odin and Loki, the trickster god who's pulling the rug out beneath our feet. So if we ever needed a story to help us understand right now, maybe Loki is helpful for us. But we also draw, for me, deeply on the Welsh mythology, which has astonishing images. The woman who turns to owls. This picture you probably can't see very clearly is Rhiannon of the White Horse. And Rhiannon of the White Horse rides past the king very slowly every day. And the king and his men get on the horse and they try to catch Rhiannon. And they go faster and faster and faster. And they're on the fastest horses. And she's just going very slowly and outpaces them every time. And the only way they get her to stop is by stopping themselves and by asking her, will you stop? Can we speak to you? And that question asks us questions that maybe we need to ask ourselves right now. What do we need to stop for? What do we need to slow down for? What do we need to stop chasing? What might we need to start a conversation with? We can draw on Arthurian romance, we can draw on the Finnish Kalevala, we can draw on Russian stories, we can draw on the amazing Native American First Nation stories that bring us Coyote the Trickster. All of these are a huge cultural resource to draw on. If we're thinking about story and we're thinking about futures and we're not engaging with this, we are missing out. So, what I've been trying to think about, and this is emergent, is what can we learn about the making of story worlds by looking at these ancient stories? And the first thing, I think, is about asking ourselves whether we write our stories just from the position of the human. So Martin Shaw has a fabulous phrase. He talks about holding an ear to Earth's furry languages. And I'll just read you this from the Kalevala, so from very early on in the Finnish origin myth. There are yet other words too, and mysteries learned, snatched from the roadside, plucked from the heather, torn from the brushwood, tugged from the saplings, rubbed from a grass head, ripped from a footpath. The cold tale told a tale to me. The rain suggested poems. Another tale the winds brought, the sea's billows drove, the birds added words, the tree tops phrases. How are we writing our stories? Who are we writing them with? Another critical thing of these stories is that characters are really stupid. They make mistakes, they take the wrong path, because if they don't take the wrong path, there is no story. And if they don't go wrong, if they don't go into the forest, if they don't go down into the underworld, there is no story. And if there is no descent to the underworld, if there's no accepting the witch's invitation, there is no learning. These are not stories that assume that we are rational, autonomous decision makers who are going to make the sensible decision based on the 4-quadrant scenario analysis in order to avoid the bad things. These are stories that say we are complicated, we are flawed, we are problematic human beings. We do not have the capacity for that sort of deep, enlightened foresight. So questions that we need to ask ourselves: do our stories allow this way of being human? I also love the way the gods are always arguing with each other. There's no single god that's going to fix out. There's a lot of them. They've got different forces. They've got different voices. And, they are going to be working against each other. These are stories that show us how forces create confusion. They create conflict. They create the unknown. And they tell us stories that difficulty, what is hard in life, is essential for something wondrous to emerge. So, to go to the Kalevala, early in it, we have this story of the desperate need of the man to grow a tree. And it's incredibly difficult for him to grow this oak tree. So what happens next is that a beast comes out of the sea and he sets a fire. And out of this huge fire comes a shoot. And out of this shoot comes this huge tree that blocks all the light of the world, that destroys every sense of where we are in the world. And out of the sea comes a little copper man who looks only the size of a thumb, but suddenly becomes the size of the world and is able to cut down this tree. And as he cuts down the tree, it falls, it splinters. The shards of the tree land in the water and travel northward, where they are gathered by a witch to make an arrow tip. The hard, the uncomfortable, the difficult creates a generative moment of possibility. These are also normative stories. They are not stories that are about assessing advantage. They are not stories about how do we do well in this environment. These are stories about balance. These are stories about how energy and wisdom, youth and age, the city and the forest, Arwen, inspiration, and logos, rationality, can be in balance with each other. And they are stories of guidance. They're stories to help us think about what might survive. This is the amazing goddess Inanna from some of the very, very earliest human stories, who has the wings of inspiration, the amazing lion of courage, and these great owls of wisdom. I mean, she rocks. This is just astonishing. Think about what it would mean to be that sort of powerful being. So critically, these stories tell us that story worlds don't have to come from the human, that they can have characters that can make mistakes, that we need to work with gods that don't agree with each other, that we can draw on difficulty, that we might work ourselves towards balance, and we might pay attention to processes of going through darkness and coming out again. They also tell us something about what it takes to create and make stories. Almost all of these stories have something about what it means to be the poet or the storyteller. And again, we see this story of the poet drawing on the world and many experiences that are not all human. I really advise you to go read this amazing poem, The Battle of the Trees. But just listen to this. I was a path, I was an eagle, I was a coracle at sea, I was bubbles in beer, I was a raindrop in a shower, I was a sword in the hand, I was a shield in battle, I was a harp string enchanted 9 years in water, foaming. I was tinder in fire, I was a forest ablaze. What does it mean to write from that position? Poets come from somewhere. They've got origin tales of their own. The people who are making stories come from a place. Taliesin comes from the cauldron of the powerful witch Ceridwen. Wainamoinen comes from the air woman, growing for centuries in her womb. Becoming a poet is not easy. There's a huge amount of shape-shifting required, labor pains, courage. This is not about doing a quick course. And they're quite honest about the fact that the bodies and needs of the storytellers need feeding. They say, if this is from the Kalevala again, I will sing quite a good tale, quite a fair one I'll beat out, after some rye bread and some barley beer. If beer is not brought and ale not offered, I'll sing from a leaner mouth. We need food, we need beer, we need feeding in order to do this sort of work. And then the question comes, who is feeding us? And what stories can we tell if we're not fed? What does this mean? These are my conjectures. What does this mean for making Storyworlds in future studies? I think it gives me a set of questions. I'd be fascinated to know what it gives you, but this is what it gives me. It gives me questions about where our roots, our anchors, our lands are as we're making our stories. How are the trees and the birds, the insects, the waves, the winds, the heat teaching us words? How are they telling us tales? What are the limits of sitting in rooms with post-it notes? What sort of stories come out of that don't come out of this? It raises questions for me about where are we born from? What worlds are going into making us? And can we make worlds that are capable of dealing with the sorts of complexity that we see in these other narratives? They make me wonder where the underworld is in our stories. Where's the darkness? And where are we becoming initiated? Where are we learning from it? Really, what I want to suggest is that a critical feature of myth is it invites us in a journey to the underworld. It invites us to break the spell of the present, not so that we can plan the future, but so that we can shake ourselves awake. So in the last presentation, there was a discussion about a threshold, the moving of a threshold. Moving across a threshold also usually involves a breaking, a loss of something, a loss of personhood, a remaking of a self. You don't come back to the world the same person. So myths, I suggest, invite us to create stories that allow us to break ourselves a little bit. These are not stories of comfort. These are stories that say, actually, maybe from this position, this continuing in this body, continuing in this shape, is not where we want to be starting if we want to make powerful stories that allow us to see the world differently, allow us to see the world in a different way. If you want a flavour of any of these, I'd suggest looking up any of these stories: The Moon Palace, The Woman Who Became a Fox, and The Firebird. And critically, I think what's implicit in what I'm saying here, but I think it's really important to say it, is that mythic storytelling here is not about corporate futures work. It's not about how we maintain advantage. It's about creating an experience that grabs us by the scruff of the neck and asks us if we want to go into the darkness, let go of everything that we know, and think about what else might be possible. And critically, this is about creating people. So the process of participating in myth, the process of participating in any rites of passage, which many of these are, is about the work on the person. It is not about the creation of a world. It's about the creation of people that are able to handle the complexity of the worlds that we're living in. Thank you.
Please take. Thanks a lot, Kerry. That was fascinating. During your talk, there were some questions posted in the chat, so I actually thought I should fire them off to you while I have you up here.
Okay.
There was one question from Jessica. What about critiques that myths reinscribe outmoded stereotypes and roles?
I think what happens is that if we read a myth through our worldview, we will see a woman as a woman. We'll see a man as a man. Whereas actually, a different way of reading it, so if we take what we call a mythopoetic approach, is to say that all characters in a story are aspects of ourselves. So you can think of the sovereign, you can think of the young man, you can think of the child, you can think of the firebird, you can think of the young woman. All of them are different aspects of ourselves. And one of the things that happens when you listen to and connect with these stories on a regular basis is different moments in a story will resonate with you at different times. So rather than being incredibly literal, which is what we tend to do when we read these things, and we say, oh goodness, this woman is, look at her, she's not fully emancipated, is actually, we say each story holds a myriad aspects of who we are, and we can see how they play off against each other as we read or as we engage or as we listen to these stories. So I think that would be the way in which I see that.
Thanks a lot. And Amos has a question reflection saying that, so there is a kind of nostalgia to myths, of course, but could this nostalgia then also guide us?
Yeah, I don't see it as nostalgic, because nostalgia usually suggests you're going back somewhere comfortable. Okay, so you got this idea that you go home and it's all nice. That's at the heart of the concept of nostalgia, that you go back somewhere safe. Actually, what these myths give us are resources for living in difficult times. That's my sense. This is not a comfy return home to, don't worry, here's a nice story of Sleeping Beauty. That's what Disney gives you. That's what Marvel gives you. Don't worry, here's a simple hero. What we've actually got here is complicated people, difficult stories that require you to think about what it means to live in very hard times. So I think they're actually the opposite of nostalgic.
Thanks a lot. We are moving on. Please be seated, Kerry. So for those of you who just zoomed in now, you have entered the session of Storyworlds and Anticipation. And we have heard two talks about Storyworlds, one on how Cameroons could provide a participatory space, and one around mythic Storyworlds. And now I hand over to Anna, please.
And first of all, I'd like to say many thanks to Kerry and Johannes, who've invited me to come here. It's my first day as a future researcher, so to speak, if I dare call myself that. And I've learned a lot, and it's been lovely being a part of this. I'm going to talk about making voices heard, about the art of listening in literary texts. And in the first place, I'd like to draw attention to Bruner's notion of narratives. According to him, we are narratives and become what we tell about. By this he means that we become autobiographical narratives by which we tell about our lives, since the ways of telling and the ways of conceptualizing become so habitual that they finally become forms for structuring experience itself, guiding the life narrative, not only up to the present, but also into the future. Accordingly, life is how it is interpreted and reinterpreted, told and retold, meaning that the negotiation of life narratives into collective narratives of who we are is crucial when we talk about facing futures. And here Bachtin is important, since he's interested in polyphony and stresses that polyphony is a many-voiced process, meaning, since he writes about novels, that literary writing has the capacity to liberate the voice of its characters from under the domination of the authorial or narratorial voice. I'd also like to point out Kent Adelman as an interesting researcher. He's been working with education studies here in Lund and interesting himself in inclusion and perspectives of listening. According to Adelman, sensitiveness and attention is something you can practice and develop. And while doing so, the interaction between closeness and distance is important. To be mentioned is also that Adelman pays attention to the listener's self-criticism in the listening process and criticism collectively. In the context, I also need to mention Martha Nussbaum, since she, in her upheavals of thought, the intelligence of emotions, do away with the dichotomy between intellect and feeling. By doing so, she differs between emotions and immediate feelings, stressing that compared to immediate feelings, emotions include evaluative judgments about what it seems good to do or attend to, meaning that emotions contribute to the development of compassion. Now to what I've been doing research on when it comes to the contribution of art and listening as a process. Right now, I'm about to finish a pilot project called Estetiken i praktiken, Aesthetics in Practice. If I'm lucky, the results of this work will be presented in a journal within a couple of months. Here I've been using a picture book, Lise Nordbåge's Samtidigt som, at the same time as, to study the perception of time among 6-year-olds. I made use of play research and written about the children's reasoning as play of thoughts, including both how something is and may turn out to be. Something that's obvious is that when there is an interplay between how something is, as is, and how it could be, as if, in the book, this evokes thoughts about time, while when there isn't, no ideas are raised among the children. Secondly, I'd like to say a few words about how polyphony could be grasped as a process that is many-voiced, and through narratology could be approached to include both the characters of the book and its readers or listeners. How do characters in picture books perceive climate change? And in what ways could the voices of books open the way for an interplay between the characters of the books and the readers or listeners? Here, attention on voice is needed. Who or what is speaking through the book? More precisely, in what ways does someone or something make itself heard? Who or what is being addressed when reading the book? And is there a witness of some kind, something that the voice refers to? And what about the voice in relation to other voices and the readers' or listeners' voices? Before I finish, I'll show you two of the books I've written about from a voice and listening perspective. Linda Bondestam's Mitt bottenliv, in my translation, My Life at the Bottom, which is a story of a rare animal called axolotl, and Emma Adboge's Naturen, the Nature. And here's one of the pages in the book about the axolotl, and yes, my translation. I grew up and got arms and legs, 8 small fingers and 10 toes. It was time for me to begin at school. In my class there were 10 small fish, 11 tiger salamanders and 13 shells, but only one axolotl, me. We got to know many important things. And while if you have a look at the other side of the spread, you find this image telling the reader or listener about the school that the axolotl goes to. If you knew Swedish, you could see that there's a lot of information to be learned at school, also about the axolotl's living conditions. However, while reading this book, you realize that there's no one that really cares about this animal. Perhaps after having read Nussbaum, you'd think that it's only the intelligence of emotions that could save this axolotl. Intellectual activities are not enough. And here's Emma Adboge's The Nature, Naturen. This is the first page. Also my translation. Everyone in the village likes the nature. We like different sorts of weather and seasons and so on. This is how it begins. And perhaps I should say that while reading this book, you realize that this is a kind of not an oppressed object, but rather kind of oppressed subject. Because after some time, this nature, who's spelled with a big N, like a name, start doing things. So a focus on voice in perhaps I should say that the problem is also that it's just as in the story about the axolotl that nobody's listening. That's why she's still, being oppressed. Or if it's a she, it's a it or whatever. Yeah. So a focus on voice in literary texts and the readers' and listeners' voices when reading these texts can open the way for talk about how something is, as is, in relation to something may turn out to be, as if. It encourages curiosity about different ways of thinking about living conditions for all kinds of life on Earth. And it creates opportunities to problematize role-taking and perspectives. Whose voice is being heard and why? Also, it may create resistance. So, by paying attention to voices and allowing polyphony, work with literary texts could mean work with making people interest themselves in contexts regarding the complexity of these contexts. It could also make people not only interest themselves in their own living conditions, but also others. And this, in turn, could encourage, for instance, ecological sensibility. Yeah, I think that.
Thanks a lot, Anna. Indeed, Storyworlds allow for multiple voices to be heard.
Yes.
I will now, very soon, you can please be seated,
Yep.
hand over to Stuart Candy at Carnegie Mellon. Are you there, Stuart?
I hope so. Can you hear me?
Lovely, good to see you. Please, we are very grateful for you volunteering upon us asking to provide some reflections from your perspective on Storyworlds. Please.
Well, look, I'm grateful for the opportunity to join you. This is an absolute feast. And it's nice that we have a bit of time for reflection and conversation here. So let me begin at the end and with Anna's remarks about listening for polyphony in literary texts. And I'm really taken with, I mean, I think this idea of the sort of polyphonic text accords really beautifully with the sort of foundational notion of pluralism in futures and of making space for not just many ways in which the world or worlds could unfold, but many different perspectives within them. And I didn't gather until the start of Anna's presentation that this is in a way a first foray into futures from her usual from her usual backyard. So I hope in the course of the conversation we can perhaps begin to stitch things together a little more and really draw out on some of these points. One of which, for me, I think connects to something that Kerry mentioned about Amitav Ghosh's work and the book *The Great Derangement*, in which he sort of, as a novelist, agonizes, I think, probably appropriately, about the question as to how adequate the novel and novels, the technology and the art form of the novel, how adequately that has responded to climate disruption as it's unfolded. And I think there's an interesting question there for us about, and I don't come at this in the spirit of wanting to, sort of clear away all novels and novelists, but really sort of being prepared, I suppose, to interrogate in the spirit of what I take this whole session to be about. What different kinds of interventions in what different kinds of forms and calling on what different artistic and mythic and narrative traditions, what kinds of effects are and aren't produced by those different kinds of interventions? And, to what extent can or does the sort of does novelistic and literary interventions sort of promise the type of far-reaching cultural change that it seems we desperately need, and urgently need? So that's a question. I suppose I also wanted to say in relation to Anna's remarks that this notion of as if as a mind opener, I'd love for us to spend a little bit more time on that and perhaps draw her out a little on how that works, and we could begin to stitch that together or kind of compare and contrast with the kind of what ifs and as ifs that we trade in futures, foresight, and anticipation. So I'm going a little bit non-linearly here. I want to jump back to Alexandra Rubin's presentation and the extremely tempting and inviting and exciting and I guess this is your work as well, Johannes, work of carbon ruins. And sort of course, I think it's important to note that what we're working with today is a kind of, a didactic storytelling about the project rather than the project itself, because I would love to visit carbon ruins. I want to experience those artifacts and interact with those characters, but of course we're hearing about it secondhand. I think that's important to notice. I grapple with this contradiction or tension a lot in experiential futures work, that we sort of in some ways find ourselves having to resort to a lot of conceptual and textual and analytic registers of discussion in order to be able to talk about the work, but that is not a substitute for the work itself, which is quite explicitly about massaging the body individually and socially in ways that that a conference talk simply can't. And that's no one's fault. That's just sort of a reality for us to, acknowledge and contend with. But in relation to what Alexandra and Ruben shared, I want to zero in a little bit on this question of what makes a story world different from the kinds of scenarios that we've been trading in all these years in futures practice. And I think they said that they're like scenarios, story worlds are, but deliberately collaborative and open-ended, and they have a work in progress quality. And what this leads me to wonder about is, I guess one sort of question by the by, if a story world is a world in which many stories can be told, which reminds me of the Zapatista sort of slogan of striving for a world in which many worlds fit, as an actual political project, not just not an artistic one. Is the real world that we live in a story world? That's a question I wonder about their perspective or our perspective collectively about that. But then pursuing that a little bit further, does this difference between I think, relatively sort of closed or linear, I'm interpolating or interpreting those words, not to put them in Ruben and Alexandra or your mouth, Johannes, but if we're going to draw a contrast between the scenario practices that we want to critique and this other thing that we're here to discuss that differs from it, being deliberately collaborative and open-ended, does the collaborativeness and the open-endedness actually inhere in the work itself, or does it have something more to do with the attitude that we bring to it as people working with those materials? And the reason I ask is because I think some years ago, we started, I've been teaching and practicing, but teaching experiential futures in a particular way for about a decade, where what we started out doing was having participants create their own stories, create their own scenarios, devised in whatever way, and we all know there are plenty of ways of doing them. They may all share some fatal weaknesses, and we'll come to Kerry's comments in a minute. But having the students or the participants themselves create those scenarios and then choose one to turn into an experience. And then after a while, I realized that we could probably get a lot further, a lot faster, if we just treated existing published scenarios as being public domain material for us to translate into experiences. So taking, a published scenario set, whether by an organization like Institute for the Future or the Foundation for Democracy and Sustainable Development, or like John Urry's book, What is the Future? There's some scenario sets in there about, I think, mobility and something else. We use those as the material with which to create immersive experiences, even though they perhaps weren't intended or designed or foreseen as being used that way. And more recently, with my students at CMU, we've used the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which I have to say aren't particularly well spelled out in terms of the worlds that they would be intended to produce if they were fulfilled. But we sort of, in a way, accepted an invitation that we considered to be implicit in the whole project of transforming the world, which is, if those things came to be true, what kinds of organizations, what kinds of initiatives, what kinds of places would this produce? And then we started making those things. So I think that's a question I'm interested in, as to how, whether we kind of need the term or the frame of story worlds even, or if we just need the attitude of being willing to and interested and ultimately, I suppose, capable of bringing the various scenarios or worlds or whatever you call them to life in the kinds of ways that we were hearing about. And I guess a related methodological kind of question is that is the story world method, as proposed by yourself, Johannes, and Alexandra and Ruben, does the method refer to or is the story world, like Carbon Ruins, the world in which you could have a version for Westeros, or a version for Glasgow, or a version, I suppose, for Pittsburgh or Paris or Gothenburg or anywhere? Or does the method consist in the bringing bits to life through artifacts and interactions and so forth? And I guess I'll tip my hand a little bit here and say I think that what we've been doing with experiential futures for the last 15 years kind of tries to get at all of that, and I'm trying to grasp what it is that this framing or this way into our challenge set kind of allows us to do differently or better. And then finally, to come to Kerry, sandwiched in the middle, and I was tempted to start with this because I wanted to, I suppose, start with where the charge really seemed to be. And Kerry, forgive me, the bit where you said, I'm nervous to say this, was the bit where I was most excited. And I want to zero in on, the point you made, with which I could not agree more, about the banality of a great deal of the storytelling or scenario manufacturing that goes on under the banners of futures, foresight, anticipation, and cognate practices. And I got goosebumps as you were talking about and invoking and telling us, sort of bringing our collective attention to these specific kind of mythic constructs and the power of them, because this is powerful material, as you said and demonstrated. And this question, what can we learn from these ancient story worlds, for what we feeble moderns are trying to do, I suppose. And I think that's a tremendous question, and I'd love to spend more time with it. I suppose, just in terms of agreeing with and feeling an almost catharsis at the naming of the insipidity of and ineffectual qualities of a lot of what we try to do with scenarios, not to mention the kind of thoroughgoing instrumentality of, just trying to very often augment corporate or organizational advantage rather than sort of speaking to community or society or planetary level obligations and norms. But I think, if we begin to, conjure with that or grapple with it, one of the questions that it takes me to is, and this is a question I guess I'm asking, not expecting that we necessarily have an immediate answer, but I'd like to sit in the uncertainty with you on it either way. What evidence do we have for the viability of new myth making on the timescale available to us now? If new myth making is what is called for, and if it's not, if it's a question more, and I think this is maybe more in line with what you were calling for or gesturing to, going back to the myths we've forgotten or allowed Disney and Marvel to sort of privatize and enclose, which is actually another issue I want to at least just mention, that the most powerful storytelling that's going on in a kind of in our in the world we appear to inhabit for the moment, is kind of going on in on an entirely commercialized basis and on an entirely capital-driven basis, which I find extremely worrying from an intellectual property standpoint for not just the fund of fairy tales and myths of the world's cultural traditions to be sort of packaged up by Disney and turned into absolute sort of candy lollies for the children of the world that they have to pay for. I really worry about that. But to kind of bring it more to a point, is the issue, if it's not a question of making new myths, because you made the point that the power of these myths derives from their having been around for so long and developed for so long and passed down from hand to hand and generation to generation for so long. But if the issue is that we've lost touch with the mythic resources that of the past, then I wonder, is it that is it possible that some of those myths actually led us to this perilous juncture that we're in? Is it possible that, that this kind of untetheredness, not just from myths, but from, the planet, from each other, and so on? I mean, it would appear that that maybe it's not the foregoing or the loss of those myths, but the acting them out, that in some cases that has led us to where we are. And I guess I noticed in the immediate beat after that thought that there's and I say this as a person perched in the United States 1 week ahead, or 3-4 days ahead of a crucial election that probably everybody is as far afield as Sweden and elsewhere is forced to hear about because of the hegemony of the setup we inhabit. But the opposing intuitions about that, whether we need to revise and revive and bring back the myths that we had, or create new ones that overwrite and consciously generate alternatives, that those almost seem to map onto the polarized intuitions of progressive versus conservative political perspectives. And I wonder what you, Kerry, and others make of that as a thought. So with that, I want to thank you, all of you, again, for your presentations. And Johannes, however you'd like us to proceed from here.
Many, many thanks. It was really useful. I would like to have the panel up here, and there were questions and thoughts and provocation, I think, for everyone. I have seen them scrabbling frantically in their notebooks. So please stand so that you can be seen. And yeah, who would like to start? Anna would like to start.
Yes,
please.
I think I'd like to start because I don't really agree with you, Stuart.
Wonderful.
Well, to put it this way, when I went on the train down here, I didn't know anything about carbon ruins, but I tried to look it up. What is carbon ruins? And then I came to think of Brecht. Brecht thought that the audience required an emotional distance to reflect on what was being presented in critical and objective ways, rather than being taken out of themselves, as conventional entertainment attempts to do. Brecht wanted to distance or to alienate his audience from the characters and the action, and by doing so make the audience intellectually understand the dilemmas and the wrongdoing producing these dilemmas. His idea was that by being distanced emotionally from the action on stage, the audience could reach an intellectual level of understanding or intellectual empathy. And being alienated emotionally to Brecht means to be empowered on an intellectual level, both to analyze and change the world, which was Brecht's political goal. But yeah, since I work with education, Brecht's reasoning is interesting. The effect of making the familiar strange may serve a didactic function insofar as it aims to teach the viewer not to take what is staged for granted, since the performance as a medium itself is constructed and contingent upon many cultural and economic conditions. However, I would say that audience reactions are rarely uniform, and there are many diverse, sometimes unpredictable responses that may be achieved through distancing.
Thanks a lot, Anna. More thoughts in relation to Stuart's comment?
Yeah, I think I want to pick up on what Anna just said, because I think it ties into lovely questions there, Stuart, on like what's the difference really between a story world and the scenario, and I think we could have a long, hard discussion on that. But I have some reflections at least, and I think one of it ties into the performance aspect and the sort of Brechtian take on what it is that we're doing, and of course that's the openness of carbon ruins. At least the way I think of it is exactly that. That it will be different every time we stage it. So there's no element of correction here. We cannot really tell the audience, no, you understood this wrong, or your memory of this object is wrong. We have to allow everyone to own this world. And I think you're right that if we do take the scenarios and we just decide let's own them, then we can make them into story worlds. So there's something interesting there to play with. But I also think that there might be another characteristic of story worlds that makes it a bit different than at least some scenarios, and that is that we can argue that story worlds are built of stories. So we need stories themselves or narratives to build the story worlds, whereas I see at least some scenarios, and the ones that I'm most familiar with are the ones that I used for climate modeling. They do not really, they're not made from stories. They're now trying to create narratives for these scenarios, but they're not really real narratives either. So I think that's two characteristics or thoughts that I want to bring in. Yeah, okay, that's my first reflection. Do you want to say something, Ruben? Or?
No, I was really intrigued by this question of whether the quote-unquote real world is a story world, and it really got my head spinning a bit. And I don't know if I have like a proper definitive answer on that question, but I mean, I come from a background in the sort of like ontological anthropology that sees the world as sort of made up of multiple realities that aren't that cannot be defined as a single one being more right than another. And I think that maybe that's how we can see maybe we can see the real world as a collection of story worlds that constantly butt heads and interact with each other and transport ideas and myths and norms and relations across each other. And I also think, to me, that the story world term that we use in Carbon Ruins is it is quite, in Carbon Ruins, it is quite explicitly a method also, which perhaps is what could be used to distinguish it from the kind of stories that we used to, or that we interact with daily outside of Carbon Ruins, because it is a way of trying to open up a discussion about certain topics and open up a discussion, a democratization of the future. And so it's a very kind of it is a tool that we use, and perhaps that's also that kind of single-minded, or not single-minded, but specific application of it is what separates it. But it was a very interesting question, and I think I will go home and think lots more about that, actually. So thank you for that head spin.
That very question also provoked some questions immediately in the chat about whether this is a QAnon world, which is where the real world is a story world. I think we in our work we have used Wolf a lot, who collected 800 or 1,200 story worlds. So from his perspective, the world consists of many different story worlds, and what characterizes them is the kind of cohesiveness and coherentness that you can pick it and you can describe it, as Alexandra picked out in the beginning. Kerry, do you have any?
Yeah, so just so much. I mean, thank you to colleagues and to Stuart. I'm thinking about polyphony and voices and complexity, and our stories, our myths, the problem. Are we living in a world that was created by them or not? And I suppose where I wonder where we are right now is whether we find ourselves in a place where we're trying to simplify the stories so that they're easy to make sense of. And I wonder if that is really where the difficulty lies. So one of the practices in live storytelling is something we call feeding the story. Okay, so a story gets told, and then everybody talks about where they find themselves in that story. So you will be in a room with 60 people, and you will hear 60 different moments of that story. And that story then, in its liveness, becomes complex. Its polyphony, its inherent polyphony becomes visible. And so I suppose for me, it isn't about, are these good stories or old myths, or are they bad? You know, are they the problem or are they the solution? It's actually the practice of storytelling, the practice of being in a live relationship with stories that hit you in different ways at different times, and that you listen to in a community, and you recognize that other people find themselves in that story in a different place from you. That, to me, is what we are missing right now. And if we think about the world of QAnon, or frankly, we think about any sort of dogmatic narration of the future, and that comes from all political perspectives, these are simplistic accounts that there is one story going on. And if there's one thing I'm absolutely convinced of, there is not just one story. There are many, many stories ongoing at the moment. And actually, the challenge that we face is how to make those visible and live with the discomfort and the complexity of that, because that's what it means to live in the world instead of separate from the world in a little bubble. So that's sort of where I'm at with what you're saying.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot. Please, Anna.
Yeah, and it's interesting how you talk about stories and myths. I remember, being at the university during the early 80s, Bruno Bettelheim was so big, psychoanalytic analysis, and, everything you could learn to develop personally from a psychoanalytic perspective through myths was so big, was so important. Everyone read Bruno Bettelheim. Also, we read Vladimir Prop saying structuralism was big, and he would say that Russian formalist more than 100 years ago, that all these stories, they resemble each other. They're really the same. And what is being focused depends on the time we're living in.
Thanks a lot, Anna. We have another 12 minutes, though we'll continue the discussion. So please continue to post your questions in the chat. If you post them on the Vova platform, they will stay there, and we can answer them also after the session if you want. And I'll also tell to the ones who are here in the audience here in Lund, I have a microphone here. So if you want to post your questions, just come up here. I'll give you the microphone, and you're also most welcome to talk. So back to you, Stuart. Do you have any more thoughts in response to what you heard?
Well, what came to mind as we were speaking just now was I think it's a kind of epigram from the frontispiece of, I want to say, Arundhati Roy's The God of Small Things, and it's, I think, John Berger saying, "Never again will a single story be told as though it's the only one." I'm not sure we're quite at that point yet, but we're still striving for it, in the course of this exchange and more widely. I'm very taken with this, with the live storytelling practice that we began to hear a little bit about just then, Kerry, from you. And it reminded me of an essay by Rick Prellinger, who's a sort of archivist here in the US. And he has worked with communities in a number of cities, probably most notably San Francisco, because I think that's where he's based. And there's this series called Lost Landscapes of San Francisco, which is a series of screenings of raw home footage from decades ago, home film footage, without commentary, not edited together not edited together to sort of tell a conventional story. And the explicit understanding that's set up with the audience is that they can yell out and where this scene is taking place from perhaps 40, 50, 70 years ago, and they sort of co-create the narrative of what is happening in real time by interacting with what's being shown. And there's an essay by Prellinger called "Assembly Over Algorithm: Resisting Over Narrativization," in which he sort of talks about the kind of superabundance of story and documentary, and kind of the way that particular interpretations are basically sort of constantly being shoved down our throats, rather than engaging in practices of the kind that you described, live storytelling and of this sort of lost landscapes approach, which I think is rare enough to be really notable and worth thinking about how we could engage a sort of futures-oriented counterpart to something as fundamentally participatory as that. I thought Anna's point about Brecht and alienation or estrangement as a crucial strategy, I really appreciate deeply. I mean, I looked briefly at Brecht as part of my doctoral work on experiential futures a dozen years ago. I think that the way that we've tried to sort of learn from that is by, and what has come about as a practice that I think maybe, to me, is an effort to get the best of both worlds, which is to say, having people be deeply immersed and emotionally invested in a hypothetical future while they're in it, but then kind of recovering their critical distance and an ability to talk about it as a, like, would we really want this? Or how likely do we think this is by realizing that we don't have to have both of those moments happening at once. You can do it sequentially. So with the time machines that I talked about before, where we turn, a world on the page, so to speak, into a world at the scale of a room, the task is we spend half the time in that world, and the ideal is to make it feel as though we're actually time traveling, hence the time machine. It's a pretty high bar, but that's what we're going for. But then the other half is like, once we sort of, end the scene and come back to the present without changing our physical location, now we're in the room talking about it in terms of what we liked or didn't like, what we think is ridiculous or highly plausible, or a bit of both about those. And I think that it's maybe possible to kind of have both the deep engagement and entrainment of interest, of good storytelling and theater and design and so forth, followed by the kind of estrangement and criticality that maybe informs decision making about how we want to vote, or how we want to how we want to devote our cycles in our own communities. And my former master student, Mike Stulberg, Stulberg, did his kind of master's thesis on this. It's available online. I can't remember what the title of it is, but it's about time machines and the different registers of thought that are simultaneously going on for participants by talking to them afterwards. And I just noticed an interesting symmetry, I guess, between some of what the Carbon Ruins team described in their interactions with participants there. I think that would be a great thing to look into further.
Thank you, Stuart. We have quite a few questions in the chat. I will sort of ask the panelists to look at them a bit and have a go. There is one question regarding using Carey's compelling statement about shocking ourselves out of the present. Could the speaker tell us how would they take into account those already shocked in darkness, those whose very futures are most fragile?
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to pick that up, Carlos. I think it's a really hugely important question. And again, I think it's all about recognizing that things are situated. One of the common, a really common thread to myth is the process of severance, leaving behind the world, entering a threshold, and return. And all of those, it requires a holder, it requires a container. It's not simply about going and getting lost in the dark. It is actually about community. So our job is not just to shock and to distort and to drag people out, but to do the work of making community with each other as well. So absolutely, this is not this. I mean, again, I would point everybody at Martin Shaw's work. I think he is the writer who is working most thoughtfully and most creatively on this at the moment. Vanessa Andreotti, who will be speaking later today, her work is also speaks very, very deeply to this, particularly to the difference between those in what she calls high-intensity struggles and low-intensity struggles. I do think, though, that if I'm speaking around futures and the way and the places in which it is getting used, we tend to be talking about places that could use a little bit of a shock. So I think, let's be clear about where we're operating and where our practice is located. But absolutely, community, the making of community, so that there is a return. So that was actually one of my questions to you guys of the carbon ruins. We're thinking about this as a rite of passage. You're saying it's a threshold. So threshold involves severance. It involves leaving something behind. But it also means, how do you incorporate it back in to your lives? And this is the thing that we never do well, actually, in most futures work, is this question of reincorporation. What does it mean to have visited somewhere else, to have gone to a different world, and then to try to bring it back?
Do you want to say
Thanks,
something
Anna.
first, Anna?
No, you could do that.
Yeah. So no, I think the question from Carlos, Carlos is fantastic, and also your question. And I mean, we've been working with that a little bit in Carbon Ruins, but not enough, I would say. But I think when it worked the best was when we actually invited communities, or we invited organizations. So it was not about single individuals experiencing this thing, and then you scatter and you're left on your own to reflect on it. But we actually invited groups, and we sat down with them afterwards for them to reflect on their experience. And we also had workshops where they would come up with objects that they would contribute with for the exhibition, but then reflect on how they would bring that back to their organization or whatever it was they were coming from. And I think that work is extremely important. But I also wanted to reflect on the work that we've been doing in Västerås, where so the Carbon Ruins was there visiting Västerås, and the hosts that Ruben was referring to, who actually did this rite of passage, they now want to develop a local version of Carbon Ruins. And I mean, when we did it here in Lund, we started off with experts mostly, who built up the world, and then we invited other peoples. And in Västerås, they wanted to do it the other way around. So they wanted to start in specific places with people who actually live there. And what happened there when we did the first sort of experiment was that many people, they were not in the capacity or place to actually talk about futures. They were talking about the end of the week. They were talking about their past. This was the stories that they needed to tell for the Carbon Ruins exhibition. And I think that's a very sort of humbling experience as well. So I don't have an answer, just these are reflections on what we've experienced.
Please, Anna.
Yeah, and I brought in the notion of voices because there's a lack of negotiation, for instance, in classrooms, where you make use of voices in narratives and voices in the classroom. It's really a lack of interpretation step by step to come deeper into what do we really think about this or that. That's perhaps, the most lacking thing in our time, I would say. And that goes with myths as well, that, you could negotiate what is this all about? Could it be something else? What do you say, and you say, and you say? What do we say?
Thank you. Kerry?
I want to conclude really. You can't hear it. Okay, sorry. So I think the critical point for me with so much of this comes back to the question, are we creating spaces that allow us to imagine together the multiple ways in which the world might be different, the multiple ways in which it might be thought differently? And are we creating spaces that are powerful enough to hold us through the emotional work that needs to be done to really conceive that things might be otherwise? And this is the challenge that I think myth and the huge growing world of storytelling, and I would say Google it in your local area and go and sit around a campfire with a bunch of people. It's massive. It is raising to us, because what they are doing is grassroots, bottom-up work to say, we will reweave our culture and we will reweave it with multiple stories. And I think that's the challenge that I want to set to our community of researchers, is how are we reweaving culture?
Thanks a lot. That was a beautiful note to end on. It's 15 past, and many thanks for Stuart for commenting, for everybody who listened, posted questions in the chat. We'll save the chat so we have it, of course. Do save it yourselves as well. Many thanks to the panel who prepared.
Thanks, Johannes.
Thanks, Johannes.
And please stay in touch with us in Lund on these matters, or with everyone here on the panel. Thanks for today.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Take care. Bye-bye.